So we'll tell you a little story about how I got started, and I should mention Asian American programming has been a huge part of why over-the-air has been revitalized. So 10 years ago, 2009, the FCC mandated something called the digital TV transition. And at the time, unless you were in the broadcasting business, you probably didn't understand the impact of what was happening. DTV had proposed in the late 90s, and it took more than a decade to implement. And there were all these different complications. And what had happened over time is that cable and satellite started to really dominate because they had diversity of programming, more channels to offer, and better quality. And that culmination, along with technology improving, and only 8% of Americans were left watching analog over-the-air TV, a very small percentage. And that's, if you guys, some of you might be old enough to remember the fuzzy pictures that some of us grew up with a pair of rabbit ears. Things changed in 2009. And as I mentioned, at that point, 100 million households were paying for cable and satellite. So this is why the industry has shifted in this way. And, well, so, not me. So, what had happened at the time, and this continues to happen now, there's been just a lot of consolidation. So we have, at this point, 10 years later, a couple hundred TV stations owned by individual groups. And even 10 years ago, you had your CBS, your NBCs, your ABCs, your Foxes. They control TV stations in all the major markets, and they control what you see and what you imbibe and the context. And while we all have Asian American reporters at these different TV stations and African American reporters and Hispanic reporters, the truth is, in terms of the editorial side of local coverage, how many minority and women folks are in management? How many are news directors? How many are general managers? And how many are ownership? Well, you can tell the numbers are quite sparse. At this point, 10 years ago, the internet as we know it today, with Chromecast and streaming and Netflix and Hulu with originals, this just wasn't the case 10 years ago. It's really come into its own over the last decade, but at that point it was still in its infancy. As I've mentioned earlier, what digital over-the-air facilitated is the opportunity for local TV stations to broadcast multiple channels. It allowed new networks to emerge, and I'll explain what that meant specifically towards minority groups and in particular Asian Americans. TV stations now who were broadcasting over the air could now tell folks with a simple $5 antenna that we could literally stick in the back of any monitor right here in this hotel or at your apartment, anywhere here in the United States, or if you want to get a rooftop antenna, you can pick up scores of channels. And this evolution has been precipitous in major markets around the country. Los Angeles is perhaps the best example here in the United States. There is a segment of television called low-power television, which has been much maligned historically because they had a very limited radius in the analog days. But in digital, low power could reach a radius of 30 miles, and it depends on if you're on a mountain or a tall tower, it could be even beyond that. And if you could get the signal, a low-power station over the air looks no different than a full-power station. And that's a very important differentiation because full power historically has had the key programming, the ABC, the NBC, the big four networks. And if you weren't on a full power station, you looked like kind of a mom and pop shop. But now with low power in digital, these stations all look good. And if folks are programming it the right way, you can be very competitive in broadcast television. And that's a very important point because a lot of minority groups have been able to take advantage of that and get programming on in parts of the country and in regions that was never even possible a decade ago.